freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. And if you and I don't do this, then you and I may well spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
Hey everybody, Cheryl Todd here from Gun Freedom Radio, and I am chatting today with my good friend Logan Metesh. Logan is a historian and writer who runs High Caliber History and has worked for museums with the NRA, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Park Service. Logan's work has been published in a variety of print and online outlets. He has served as a historic arms facilitator for Mysteries at the Museum, Gun Stories with Joe Mantegna, and Rifleman TV. Welcome to Gun Freedom Radio, Logan.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's great to be back.
Absolutely. So I could probably have you on every single day and never exhaust your personal knowledge of history as it pertains to firearms. And so anytime we get a chance to sit down and talk together, I wish I could just kind of put my thinking cap on, sit back and let you run. Because I just want to be a student, you know. But the one thing that was kind of on our minds lately is all the gun laws, everything's just words are being thrown around. And one of the phrases that we hear over and over is that there's just no way that our founding fathers would have ever possibly anticipated the kind of weaponry, right, that we have in our modern age. And so they couldn't have been thinking about things like repeating rifles when they were crafting the Second Amendment and the wording thereof, that they, by the way, punctuated with shall not be infringed. So talk to us about the reality of that. Could our founding fathers have envisioned something as crazy as a repeating rifle?
Sure. You know, not only could they did. And they did it long before they drafted the Second Amendment. It was in the Second Continental Congress in 1777, in fact, that the first real push for the concept of a repeating rifle in the Continental Army was brought up. So how's that for bringing repeaters in early?
Myth busting right out of the gate. We're not
That's
even 5
right.
minutes in and you're already busting myths with, how, people want to think that our founding fathers were just like these little waifs, these one-dimensional creatures who didn't live the multifaceted, dangerous, right, and lives and have the foresight and forethought that they did. And you're showing us right here that even with the tools themselves, the machinery themselves, they had actually experienced these things that people want to debunk. So talk to us about those repeating rifles. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so it all starts with a gentleman. His name is Joseph Belton, and he is a gunsmith in Philadelphia. And he writes a letter to the Continental Congress on April 11th, 1777, and he lets them know that he has devised a new flintlock that can fire as many as 16 shots in 20 seconds.
A flintlock?
A flintlock,
that can do that?
That can do that. That's what he was claiming. 16 shots, 20 seconds. And he said, I'm available to demonstrate this to you at any time. Well, the Continental Congress was obviously intrigued by this claim. And so they ordered 100 examples of this gun. Think about that. They ordered 100 examples. And so they authorized him to oversee the construction of new guns or the alteration of existing guns so that they could fire those rounds. And they didn't even want him to push it as high as 16. They said, hey, even if you can do 8 rounds, we'll be impressed, right? And So they told him that he could, quote, receive a reasonable compensation for his trouble and be allowed all just and necessary expenses, end quote. Because, of course, the government's always looking to pinch pennies, even back in 1777.
They weren't then, because they were like, wait a minute, you've got some fabulous new invention, and we're going to try 100 right out of the gate.
Yeah, and that sounds great. But money is always an issue when it comes to government.
Yes.
And there was a quibble right away between Joseph Belton and the Congress on their definitions of reasonable compensation. And so yeah, imagine that, right? So Belton wanted to arm 100 soldiers with his invention and determine with a panel of 4 military officers, two chosen by the Continental Congress and 2 of his choosing, to determine how many men armed with his guns that they felt those men were equal to armed with single shot muskets. So for example, 100 of Belton's armed men were equivalent to 200 armed men, doubling it, or so on or so forth. So sounds simple enough, right?
So let me take you off course for a second. So was he then therefore thinking, so I can get twice the amount that they would pay for a normal rifle because it's worth 2 men? Is that kind of where he was leaning, or?
Well, he wasn't even necessarily looking so much per rifle as he's looking per man, which is where it gets really, really crazy and what causes the confrontation.
Okay.
Yeah, so he says that if he can double the effectiveness, 100 men equaling 200 men, that he wants 1,000 pounds. And of course, the exchange rate, to put it into today's dollars and everything, 1,000 pounds in 1777 is about 150,000 pounds today, and we're sitting at an exchange rate of £1 to $1.10. So $160,000, $170,000 if he can double it.
Wow.
And he wants it to go up and up and up from there. So if it's 300, then it's 2,000. You can extrapolate, and so he decided that this was going to be something he would make available to all 13 colonies. And so if you're doing the math and you get all 13 states or all 13 colonies outfitting 100 men, he'd get 13,000 pounds, which adjusted for today's dollars is 1.9 million pounds, or a little over $2 million.
Nice payday.
Nice payday. He argued that arming 3,000 men or more with his guns created innumerable advantages on the battlefield, and that doing so made his rate of compensation, quote, vastly reasonable. Mm-hmm. And as such, his terms were non-negotiable. If Congress wanted to quibble with him in any way, he's done. He's absolutely done. And so he sent off a letter to them saying, hey, take it or leave it. I could go either way. But
he's the guy with the good equipment, right? And he's saying,
right.
What are lives worth, right?
Right.
What is victory worth? So he really was sitting in a strong negotiating position.
He was in a very strong position, but he had a little bit of Thomas Paine's common sense running through his blood, because he must have immediately realized that his terms were kind of ridiculous. So the very next day, he wrote another letter, and he actually addressed this one specifically to John Hancock, and he lowered his fees. He cut them in half. So instead of 1,000 pounds, he just wants 500 to double, 1,500 to triple, 2,000 to quadruple, and so forth. He figured cutting it in half would suffice, right? The Congress got his letter. They read it aloud to the body on May 15th, and they dismissed it because of his, quote, extraordinary allowance.
And this was the second one where he'd already, kind of chopped it down a little bit?
Yeah, he'd already cut the price in half, and they were like, yeah, no, still too much money. So they're like, all right, we're done. May 15th, we're done. And they didn't bother to reply to him. They figured, no news, he'll get the hint, and he'll go on his merry way. But they were wrong. He was determined. So that was May 15th. On June 14th, he writes them another letter. Now he's up in the ante. He says that not only can these guns fire that many rounds, but that they'll be accurate out to 100 and even 200 yards, which is astounding out of these flintlock rifles at that time. And he said he'd be happy to demonstrate it to the Congress on the following Monday at 10 a.m. in the State House yard, which, of course, today is known as Independence Hall on the green there in front of the State House. So he wants to go set up a 200-yard shooting range in front of Independence Hall. He's really, really pushing for this, right? But he doesn't get an answer. And so, again, assuming that, hey, if we don't respond to this guy, maybe he'll just kind of bugger off and leave us alone. They were wrong. He writes him again on July 10th. This time, he's not so kind. He has decided he's not pulling any punches anymore. And in his letter, he claims that Great Britain regularly pays £500 for these kind of services. And if that, quote, little island could afford such payments, surely this, quote, extensive continent could do the same. So he's really pushing his luck, right? Then he pushes it even further, though. In addition to that, he encloses a letter signed by some big-name individuals, including General Horatio Gates, Major General Benedict Arnold, before he becomes a turncoat, well-known scientist David Rittenhouse, and others. And they all signed their names claiming that his invention would be, quote, great service in the defense of lives, redoubts, ships, etc., and even in the field. And they felt that he was entitled to a handsome reward. Well, Congress finally got the hint that this dude wasn't going away if they just ignored him. So they were going to have to move quick on things. And in order to do that, they immediately pushed through his request to the Board of War, which was made up of 5 delegates. And among those 5 were future second president of the United States, John Adams, and Benjamin Harrison V, the father and great-grandfather of the 9th and 23rd presidents, respectively. 9 days later, July 19th, Congress gets word from the Board of War. And to Belton's dismay, they had completely decided that, nope, we are done. This is not something we're going to fund. His terms are absolutely unreasonable. Let him know that this is kaput. He pushed his luck and he pushed it too far. And he finally got the hint that Congress was not going to spend that kind of money on an experimental weapon. And he doesn't bother to write again, or at least we assume he doesn't bother to write again. No correspondence beyond July 19th shows up between the Continental Congress and Belton. So it's assumed that he finally took the hint and decided to move along. But where does that put us in terms of repeating rifles and the Founding Fathers? It makes you wonder, well, how does this apply, right? And it's absolutely applicable, even though they didn't end up getting the guns, because people are claiming, well, they couldn't have possibly known about repeating rifles. That's what we're trying to debunk here. Whether or not they actually received the guns and used them is a moot point. That doesn't matter, right?
Correct. It's the machinery, it's the technology that people want to say that, you know, there's no way that our founding fathers would have been able to project themselves into today and see things like revolvers, right? And
right.
AR-15s and, you know, those kinds of things, that they would have been completely aghast and their minds would have been blown. And Belton's example, Joseph Belton's example from history shows us, no, they wouldn't be aghast. It was just a matter of, he was a terrible and emotional negotiator, and he kept his own deal before he had a chance to see it come to fruition.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And because whether it's 1777 or 2019, the government's always looking to give the contract to the lowest bidder. And he unfortunately was the only bidder and still managed to price himself out of the deal. So
He argued with himself in front of Congress via letters and
lost, managed to lose to himself. Yeah, you know, so it takes a special kind of individual, right?
That's true.
But again, that's all a moot point, because here we are 14 years before the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791. In 1777, the founding fathers in Congress on the record say, hey, this guy's got a repeater. Let's order these guns from him. Boom. There it is. It's literally in black and white. You can't argue with it. People will try, but they shouldn't, because facts are facts.
Do you think that if there was a way to cut through all of the, I think, willful ignorance that's out there, do you think that it would make a difference? Or do you think that people are just so set in what they think they know, and just so set that they think that like ARs are just this horrible, evil creation? And I know you're not a political guy, so I'm not trying to lead you into that kind of conversation, but sometimes I think that it doesn't matter what's true or how often we can try to tell people it's true. If they can dismiss it, they're going to. And I know that's frustrating to those of us that do value history and the examples
Right.
thereof.
Yeah, I wish there was a magic wand that I could wave and this wisdom would be imparted to everyone, and that they would be receptive of it. But the fact of the matter is that that's just not the case. You know, this story that we just recounted, you know, I've had it published on multiple different blogs online. It went in a print publication nationwide. It's been on a YouTube video viewed thousands of times. You know, you can lead a horse to water, but you'll drown him trying to make him drink. And that's kind of where we're at here. We can't stand on the necks right at the edge of the pond as much as we might want to sometimes.
It's so true. And there are so many unintended consequences of people ignoring history, and either ignoring it in the sense that it's out there and they're not curious enough to find out, or ignoring it in the sense that, well, yeah, I heard that, but whatever, I don't want to act on it.
Right.
There's so many times when there are these unintended consequences that later people turn back around and go, oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Being one of the impacts of like piling, you know, anti-gun laws on top of anti-gun laws. And that takes me to our next point, something that's going on in Australia. And you're such the perfect person to talk about this, because you do have such a heart and mind for history, and you do have such a heart for museums themselves. As a matter of fact, you and I met at a museum symposium
Yes,
the first time, because we're both understanding how important museums are to
Right.
preserving history and helping to tell our stories as people and as nations. And all of those stories in some way intersect with our technology, with our tools, and some of those tools, like it or not, happen to be things that launch projectiles, such as firearms.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what is happening in Australia that has to do with gun laws and museums?
So this is kind of a fascinating story, because part of what we're going to talk about kind of rings true here. In November of 2017, the government in New South Wales passed a new regulation for museums that didn't get brought up and brought to the knowledge of the museum workers in New South Wales until February of 2019. It went like a year and a half before they were even aware that the law had been enacted. And in a sense, that's kind of seems like we have some of that happen here. You know, laws are on the books and people are never made aware of the laws that are on the books until, oh my goodness, suddenly you're in violation of this law you knew nothing about.
True.
Yeah. So November 2017, they put this new legislation in And it finally comes to light, as I said, in February 2019, particularly at the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum. And they have discovered that the regulations that were enacted say that all pistols, self-loading long arms, submachine guns, and machine guns are now to be rendered permanently inoperable.
So now they have to take a piece of history and they have to do something to it to alter it in some way, which right there, if you're somebody that preserves historical artifacts, you're like, oh, you're doing what?
Yeah, exactly. So previously, all they had to do was remove the firing pin. You know, and you and I know, you take a firing pin out of the gun, it's not a gun, it's not going to go bang.
Right.
And so, miraculously, they were wise enough to only make it removal of the firing pin until this new legislation in 2017. Now they have to be permanently rendered inoperable. And get ready to cringe and have your skin crawl, because this is what they have to do. And note, it's not, pick one of these and do it. It is everything on this list. So one, insert a steel rod traversing the length of the barrel and weld it at the muzzle and the chamber.
Weld it. You said weld it.
I said, I'm going to say it a lot more, unfortunately.
And it doesn't matter if this is something that a famous general had in his possession. It doesn't matter if it's beautifully engraved. Just stick a rod in there and weld it.
Yep.
Oh my God.
And once you've welded a rod in the barrel, then you have to weld the barrel to the receiver. You have to remove the firing pin, which used to be the only requirement. And then once you've removed the firing pin, now you have to weld the hole closed so that you can't insert the pin again.
Stop it. Wait, you muted yourself somehow. That's how upset we're getting here, because we're welding things that should never be welded.
Oh goodness, am I
back? Okay.
Okay. All right. So let's recap. We'll go back. So first, you have to start by inserting a steel rod traversing the length of the barrel and welding it in place. Then you have to weld the barrel to the receiver, remove the firing pin and weld the firing pin hole. Remove all of the internal springs. Weld in place all of the internal components. Weld any bolts and external hammers in place, and weld the trigger in a fixed position.
Basically you've made just a chunk of metal that no longer resembles what it was previously and completely destroys the value, right? Now, not everything's about financial value, I understand that, but the historical significance is now forever altered. If these laws change back, or if for some reason Australia's like, well, let's just sell all these guns, get them on some other continent or something, they are worthless to anyone. These ridiculous rules.
Yeah, and I think the folks at the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum summed it up perfectly. They said it'll render these pieces of history into metal blobs.
Yes.
And that's exactly what it would do. And they've got pieces in their collection that are prototypes. They've got pieces in their collection from different military trials that were never adopted by the Australian Army. They've got examples of, just more modern everyday guns. Take, for example, a Smith & Wesson 500 Magnum revolver that, because of the gun laws there, the only place an Aussie can see that gun legally is in a museum, and they would have to basically render it absolutely useless in order for it to still be legal and on display there. But it gets worse.
No, it does not.
It does.
Okay. All right. Fine. I'll take a breath. I'll sit here. I will be in physical pain. Just know that. But go on.
So it gets worse when it very well could have gotten better. So that was February of this year. And in the months between February and the end of August, all of the folks at the museum there in Lithgow and at a variety of other museums throughout Australia were working with the government there, trying to figure out how they could craft an amendment to this regulation that would still, meet the flavor of the law that the lawmakers were trying to get across, and yet still preserve the tremendous amount of history that is in those collections and only in those collections. And for all their credit, the folks at Lithgow really thought they'd made progress. They'd met with the governing bodies, and they got an audience, and they felt like they were being listened to right up until the amendment was released on August 30th. The problem with this is that they now have finally determined who exactly is making the determination on these guns and who has the final say in order to have the museum firearms license there. And it has now been determined that it's up to the local police commissioner to determine whether or not he's going to grant an exemption from having the prohibited pistols and other firearms permanently deactivated.
Somebody who may or may not even fully understand the damage and the harm that he is doing to the history of his own nation.
Right. Moreover, someone who, with a political agenda, who may appreciate the history but not care for the politics of guns, can simply say, nope, I'm going to override, and we're not going to allow you to renew your museum exemption. And it's absolutely heartbreaking that you would give that kind of authority to one essentially irrelevant individual to this process.
And somebody that it's going to change. I don't know how often they, their police commissioners come and go. I don't know whether it's an elected office or if it's an appointed office. I don't know how that happens, but, suppose that the next one comes along and has a completely different idea from all of this. There's nothing he or she can possibly do to reverse this.
Right.
I just think it's criminal to me. I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah. Well, and again, to keep with the theme of what we have been talking about, it's government enacting laws without really understanding the repercussions. They have decreed that the commissioner can grant the museum exception if he or she is satisfied that it's reasonable in the circumstances, and that it can be granted unconditionally or subject to conditions and can be amended and revoked. But there's a lot of key words in there that have no definitions, such as reasonable, circumstances, granted, amended, revoked. They haven't defined what any of that means. So who's defining it? Is it the individual commissioner each time? I don't have an answer because they don't have an answer yet either. And it's creeping up on them imminently as to what is going to have to be done to these firearms and these collections. Because if you take a firearms museum and turn it into a metal blob museum, I don't really want to go to a metal blob museum. Do you? And I love museums, but I'm not going to the Museum of the Metal Blob.
No. And so I'm sitting here and I'm picturing, I'm not an art aficionado, but somebody out there listening is. And so let's say that it's the David statue, or let's say that it's a really famous painter who has a beautiful and famous painting, but there's something that somebody finds lurid. There's nudity. We can't have that. Or there's something on there that somebody decides, symbolism nowadays is such a huge thing. That another subjective thing that people decide, this is what I say that symbol means, and therefore it is now bad in any context. So they come along with a big old house painter sloppy brush, right? And they just go slap, slap all over whatever the offending thing is on this priceless, not just in dollars, but priceless to the art world and the progression of art.
And culture in general.
Culture, right. They just slap it with paint so that it covers up something that for right now in this particular moment in time makes them feel better. They've done something permanent and something you can't undo. Yeah. So if we put it in those terms, maybe other people out there listening could feel that internal angst and pain that we're feeling. And just because we're talking about guns does not make it any less egregious.
Right.
How many times did you say the word weld?
Too many.
That's a slap of that paint with the big old house painting brush, the ruler for the wall, take that to a Monet or something.
Yeah.
That would make anybody cringe. But because we're talking about guns, people go, guns are bad anyway, so who cares?
Right. Yeah. It's as if someone finally said, you know what, that sly grin / smirk thing that the Mona Lisa's got going on, that offends me. We've got to turn that into a frown. And her exposed hair, scandalous. Better put a beanie on her. Those are all the rage. And so now she's got this faceless expression and a frown, and she's wearing a beanie. And in 2019, we feel better about that. Well, there's no getting that back. You've now defaced the Mona Lisa. Does it still exist? And that's the thing. Does it still exist? Sure, the Mona Lisa still exists, but it in no way, shape, or form still represents what it once did. Same with with these firearms. If you take this piece of mechanical art, in a sense, and weld up all the moving parts, well, what do you have? Again, we go back to the metal blob statement again, that they had so accurately determined it. And it, unfortunately, I think has the potential to go a step further, because we know the issues that Australia has with gun control in their country already. And so if this is what they are decreeing is to be done in museums, collectors could be next. And so
I'm surprised they didn't start with collectors, because you would think that museums themselves, and it does sound like they are standing up, but I would think that museums would have the power of the donors behind them, the power of just the fact that they are the keepers, right? They are the stewards of our memories and of our history. So
sure.
If they don't have the chops to be able to push back on this, collectors it's already done. They just don't know it yet.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it, unfortunately, I think will get pushed even further, because all of these egregious things that we've talked about having to be done to these firearms, we're dealing with what you and I consider to be modern firearms. So it's important to note that true, actual antique rifles in Australia are exempt from this at the moment. Again, it becomes that slippery slope. If they say, hey, we like that we got all of these more modern guns turned into metal blobs, let's do it to the flintlocks and the matchlocks and the wheel locks. And where does it end?
I don't know that it does end. And, again, what it does is it indicates that it's the tool that's bad. Like right. Human beings would never harm each other if it wasn't for that tool. Are they taking the swords, right? The broadsword,
Right.
are they chopping those into pieces, or are they embedding them in some kind of, encasement so that they can never be taken out with and have a sharp edge again? No, they're focused on this one particular tool, which
Right.
the message that were it not for these tools, mankind would just hold hands and sing Kumbaya into the sunset. And that is not true, because for every time someone has misused a tool, right, of defense, a sword, a gun, you can cite at least one time that someone has used it to save lives. So,
Sure.
and then again, that's about the heart of the person and the intent of the person holding it. I know I'm preaching to the choir here about that, but it's just when we do extrapolate and we say, well, what if it was something offensive on a piece of art? Or what if it was the sword collection that they were doing this to? We're like, that's stupid. Like, nobody would do that.
Right.
Why do we not have that exact same reaction when it comes to firearms?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is the question, and it's the one that you and I and everyone else in our like-minded community and in the museum community now, we're all having to try to figure out what's next. Why are we having this reaction to this and not the other? No one's saying you got to cut the strings on crossbows.
Good point.
Right. But
file down those pointy arrowheads, right?
That's right. Yeah, better nap the tips right off of those arrowheads.
Oh man. So I mean, is there any kind of a good outlook? How do you think that? I mean, if you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think that the curators there in the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum, do you think they're going to have any success being able to reason with the powers that be?
I don't know. On the one hand, you'd like to think that they might be open to reason. But on the other hand, they had from February to August, and they did speak with the authorities, and the authorities didn't listen. But we've now got something in this day and age that certainly previous generations didn't have, and of course that's the internet. And 20 years ago, you and I we wouldn't be sitting here having this video chat anyway. But 20 years ago, we would have had no idea that this was going on in Australia in their museums. But now it has been brought in front of a global audience. And it has been brought to the attention of museum professionals in firearms museums and otherwise worldwide. And I know that as part of this process, there were a number of individuals who signed on to a letter that was sent to the government there in New South Wales, petitioning from firearms museum curators across the world. Awesome. To try to bring some awareness to this. So, it might be kind of corny to use the phrase, the world is watching, but we really are. You're in Arizona, I'm in Virginia. We've talked about all of this out in Wyoming at one time. We've brought it full circle, and there's far more awareness of what's going on and the repercussions that can be had at museums in the United States, in the UK, in the Netherlands. It could happen anywhere. It absolutely could happen anywhere.
So that does give me hope that because the world has become somewhat smaller because of the digital age that we're living in, and that we can conference call in this kind of way across states or across oceans, that can have a huge impact really either way,
Yeah.
A bunch of people get together and are like, yeah, guns are bad. Agree with me? Yeah. Okay, good. You don't? Oh, delete. Okay.
Right.
So,
yeah.
But then knowing that, like this museum symposium that we met at, that it is a growing group of people, a growing community, And that even, I think I was there the second year that it existed, and there were already people there from the UK and from Austria, I believe, maybe New Zealand, I can't remember. So I think that can only be good as well, because
absolutely,
the people sitting in that room, it's not like they're a bunch of gun ladies and gun guys necessarily. Some of them, maybe in any other context, would be like, I don't care too much for this whole gun thing. But they're focused on the historical importance of securing the historical items. And that is encouraging to me, that we haven't completely lost that, where people are so divided on a topic like guns that they can't even, find themselves in a conversation where they're like, no, this is, outside there, maybe that's a gun I wouldn't care to own or have anybody else own. But in here, this item is part of my collection, my what's the right word when you're inside of a museum?
No, you were right. It's part of the collection. You're absolutely right with that. And the museum community is, by definition, it is a close-knit, small community. There's only so many of us in the field, and even globally, it is a close-knit community. And you're right. Whether you like the object or not, it's in your collection, and it's your duty as a museum professional to care for that object in the best way possible. I've worked in collections with beautiful, wonderful paintings. I'm really not that much of an appreciator of art.
Like, meh.
I could take it or leave it, but did I treat those pieces with the utmost respect and handling to ensure that they are available for future generations to appreciate? Absolutely, because that was my job.
I love it.
And that's how it needs to be moving forward. And we have seen that with the colleagues that you and I have both met working at museums in the United Kingdom and in Canada and in other countries where civilian ownership is either prohibited or severely curtailed. They recognize the importance of the objects that they have within their care, and they know that if the public wants to see these things legally, this is the only way to do it. And they understand that, and they appreciate that aspect of the history. And that's what I think is cool about the museum community, is that even if you personally don't have an appreciation for something, you appreciate that others appreciate it. And it, the rising tide raises all ships, or however that statement goes. And so you preserve the Mona Lisa and the flintlock, and everybody benefits. So
absolutely. And we'll start wrapping up here real quick, but going through the Cody Firearms Museum in Wyoming is such an experience that I would encourage anybody, even the most vehemently anti-gun human being that exists out there, walk through and understand how these pieces of technology evolved, the human ingenuity that it took to improve them in the ways that they improve them, and that so often it was because of battlefields. And that if you can think about the American lives, right, because we're American, we're United States citizens, that these what was his name, Joseph Beltons of the world, whether he was just like a guy that loved tinkering, or whether he truly was somebody who was like, look, this thing I'm building is going to save lives. Give me a chance and a bunch of money, right? But that what one person built, then somebody else could look at and go, oh, well, what if we did this one thing to it? And then other artists came along and said, but what if we did this beautiful engraving on the outside? And, you know,
Right.
then people used those things, and it sparked another, you know, idea in their mind that, you know, maybe was used in improving bicycles or typewriters, or think of, and you would be able to think of more than I would, but like the Winchester firearms brand, didn't they make all kinds of other things, not just firearms?
Yeah, Winchester made a bunch of different things. Colt made a bunch of different things. Smith & Wesson made a bunch of different things. They did, Smith & Wesson did like toilet plunge levers and stuff at one point, you know?
Skates, roller skates, one of them did.
Right, Winchester did roller skates. Yep, exactly. And look at World War II. You know, you get the Singer Sewing Machine Company making pistols, and Remington Rand going from typewriters, and so it's all sorts of stuff. That invention as a global and universal concept. All inventors are standing on the shoulders of the ones that came before them. You know, and you only have to look at, you only have to look at one modern patent and go look and see all of the predecessors and patents that they cited in that. The stuff that on the surface doesn't even look remotely relevant, but you realize, oh, well, in order to make that one small part do this, it relates to that, and that's how that patent is applicable. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's all intertwined, and you get rid of that one corner piece, and it's like Jenga, and everything falls.
And then you take us back to Australia and the fact that everything's going to be, you know, welded and welded and welded, so that people can't then deconstruct it, and you know, future inventors and future generations of great minds can't then look at it and go, oh, I see what they were going for here, but what if I could do that? And then it pertains to something that may not have anything to do with guns. They've taken,
Right.
will be taking that piece away. And correct me if I'm wrong, but people go to museums all the time and ask for permission to interact with the items, so that they are, you know, thinking about inventions, or, you know, even like the movies and stuff, and they're doing illustrations and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. It's very common for people to consult with museums to gain a better understanding on how things work. And a lot of museums have what they call study collections, so that they have examples that can be taken apart and worked with. And, you know, for example, the Institute of Military Technology down in Titusville, Florida, is run by Reed Knight, who runs Knight's Armament. And they've got a lot of the Eugene Stoner prototype parts from the AR weapons that he was working on. And they routinely go through and take stuff apart in their collection to figure out how to improve the modern day Knight's Armament stuff that is helping the guys on the battlefield today.
Yeah.
And they're doing that because of a museum.
Right. So it's important, this stuff that we're talking about. Well, thank you so much for all the time you've spent with us, Logan.
Thanks for having me.
How do people learn more from you? How do they use your mind that's just crackling with historical knowledge? How do they follow your blogs? All those things.
Yeah, the easiest way, the one-stop shop, if you will, is highcaliberhistory.com. From there, you can find the blog, you can find the links to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube channel, my Patreon page. You want to become a patron if you support the work that we're doing here. There's a lot of great perks that you can get there. But it's all available at your fingertips at highcaliberhistory.com. Fantastic.
Logan Metesh of High Caliber History, thank you again so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl Todd of Gun Freedom Radio.
Absolutely. And stick around, because there is always lots more coming up on Gun Freedom Radio.